Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. Um, so first of all, I want to welcome everyone into the space. We'll be starting the event now. My name is Eunice, and I'm going to be moderating for you today. I'm a transnational Korean American student and a third year at Pitzer. I study English and Asian American studies. And I will pass it off to my co-moderator, Stephanie, to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie Lee Rojas. I'm the Writing Center Director here at Pitzer College, and I'm so excited about our guest today. And I'll let Eunice begin.
Yeah, so I want to introduce our guest, Tom, who has so generously come on his time to speak about his book. Tom Lin is a novelist and doctoral candidate at the University of California, Davis. His debut novel, The Thousand Crimes of Ming reimagines the traditional Western following a Chinese-American assassin in the last days of the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad. It won the 2022 Andrew Carnegie Medal for Excellence in Fiction and was a finalist for the New York Public Library's Young Lions Award and the Northern California Book Reviewers Award in Fiction. His scholarly research investigates the role of science fiction and popular culture in the shaping of large technical systems such as the Atlas intercontinental ballistic missile, using a hybrid approach that draws from the intersection of the history of technology and literary studies. And his current projects include a new novel forthcoming in 2026, as well as an exploration of American nuclear tourism. Is there anything you want to add to that?
That's fantastic. Thank you.
All right, so I'm actually really excited to talk about all the things about you as a writer and about your book as well. But I think the first question I would like to ask you is, tell us all how you decided to become a writer.
That is a great question. So I've always, when I was a kid, I wanted to be a novelist. I think in the same way that cooler people want to be like astronauts or firefighters. And I remember having these dreams of being like a working writer, and then discovering kind of how impossible that was, and kind of what a long shot it was. And so I went to Pomona. So when I got to college, I thought that I would I would try to be as close to books as I could, whether or not I was writing them. And so I studied English. And after I finished my degree, I was working for my friend's parents' toy company. I was calling toy stores across the country and trying to get them to buy jigsaw puzzles. And I was doing that. And I was also, I had this book idea that I was kicking around in my head. And I got into graduate school. And I remember thinking, if I don't do this before I start this next big thing, I'm never gonna write anything. And so I kind of I had just moved to Davis, California. I had ordered all my furniture for this is not interesting. I'm just now realizing, but I had ordered all my furniture for the Labor Day sale, and I had expected it to arrive when I got to my new apartment. So I had a desk and everything. I had a whole kind of dream about how I was going to finish my book, and I got there, and the only thing that was there was an armchair. And then the Comcast guy hooked up internet, and so that was kind of my studio was the world's least comfortable armchair, and me looking at the wireless router across the living room, and that's how I wrote the book. I had a lot of notes. I stitched all the scenes together, and I kind of finished it in this kind of mad dash, and then I revised it and sent it off, and then incredibly, luckily it was accepted. But it was kind of I guess stumbling towards being a writer, just despite my best efforts not to.
Yeah, I know you talked a little bit about the process of you becoming a writer and publishing and things like that. I'm wondering specifically, what was your experience like being a BIPOC or international writer in the U.S. and how has that sort of impacted the trajectory of your career and things like that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I was born in China, and then I immigrated along with the rest of my family, first to Australia and then to New York. And my mom was working long hours, and my dad had gone back to China. And so it was this kind of thing where my childcare involved just after school, I would walk to the library and kind of entertain myself until my mom got off work and could pick me up. And so I spent a lot of time in that library, and I'll tell you which one. It's the Queens Public Library. And I read all of the books in there, and I really, I loved reading. That's how I learned English, and got that love of writing. But when I started writing my own stories, like even in middle school or early high school, and looking back on them, when I can bear it, they all feature white people and white characters and kind of stories and lives that were not my own. And I think it's a function of. So I think stories do more than just tell a good story. They also structure the way that we think of the world, and they also contain limits that are kind of encoded within those stories of what is possible, what kind of stories are valid, and what kind of stories deserve to be told and retold. And so I realized that I had kind of unconsciously accepted those limits as my own. That I was a Chinese American, but all of the books that I read, like most of them were about white people, and so I thought I had to write, in order to be a writer, I had to write white stories, which I didn't have access to. Right, that wasn't my story. And so I think like one of my biggest revelation was realizing that I should write, and that it was possible to write stories about what I knew and the kind of the life that I was familiar with, as opposed to trying to kind of fit into this preordained structure of literary storytelling. And I think I'm also very lucky. The landscape of publishing has shifted. It's glacially, perhaps, but it has shifted, and people are becoming more aware of stories of color and like doing more to uplift those. So I think for me it was much more of a cognitive or kind of horizon realization. But I've been lucky enough to be really supported by a great team, and they were all pulling for my story and for Ming. So I have nothing but good things to say about that process. But I think it really begins with knowing that some stories are encoded into culture in a way that prevents other stories from being told.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And I feel like that I've had similar shared experiences growing up. But you did talk about, the process, briefly talked about the process of writing your book. And I'm curious, what is your writing process like?
I really, really hate writing. And every time I say that, someone will be like, and it's rewarding, right? And I have to kind of, it is rewarding, and I do think it is worthwhile. But I hate writing. I think it's so difficult, and just an excruciating kind of monkish antisocial process that borders on delusion, right? Because you're no fun at parties. What are you doing? Oh, I'm thinking about things that don't exist and like a story that hasn't happened. But I think like for me, writing is worthwhile because it is so hard and so painful and kind of requires so much of me. But to answer the question more specifically, because of that, my writing process largely consists of avoiding writing if I can. And so I do a ton of research. I do a ton of field work. I do a lot of outlining and kind of sketching out scenes. But I really do put off writing until the very last minute when I can't avoid it. And then at that point, I kind of try to do it as all at once, as much as I can, because you also have to kind of get ahead of steam and like build momentum, and I hate it. So I think most of my process is like setting myself up for success when I do finally, get in that armchair and try to blast out the whole manuscript.
Yeah, I think one of the things. I think one of the things that really struck me about like the Thousand Crimes of Ming was how well researched it was and sort of the minute like detail that you put in it. So I was wondering like what kind of research do you complete to prepare your stories, and can you walk us through the process of that as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So I Thousand Crimes of Ming is a Western. I grew up reading a couple Westerns, but I wasn't like really like a huge Western superfan. And so one of the things that I thought was like, if I was going to write a Western, I had better be really well prepared to write it. And so I wanted to get as much as I could a historical sense of like the West and at that time period, especially also because the book has a lot of like magical realist elements, like kind of fantastical elements. And I think if you are going to ask the reader to believe something as crazy as like superpowers, you should make sure that they feel like they're starting from solid ground. And so for me, providing a kind of meticulously researched backdrop was one way of getting buy-in from the reader. But I mean, it was also again, it was a way of procrastination, right? So like I did a lot of field work because it was easier than writing. I did a lot of research and kind of archival digging because it was easier than writing. And there are parts of this book that are like kind of uselessly well researched. There's a scene. These are not spoilers, but there's a scene where like the main character, he goes up to a lake, and he like gets a cup of water from it because he hasn't had anything to drink in a long time, and that lake was a little larger in the past because of the way that we've kind of terraformed the land around it. And so one thing that I wanted to figure out was like, is this lake going to be drinkable water? And it was 6 hours out of the way, so I actually didn't make that drive, but I looked up the U.S. Geological Survey's like archives of water salinity for that lake, and then I kind of took a running average, and then I used a bunch of like Google calculator things to figure out how much table salt I should add into a glass of water. This was all in my kitchen, and then I made a glass of appropriately salty water, and I like drank it, and I was like, I think that's fine. And so like all of that like for 2 sentences, you know. And I think like part of it is like that it's a delay tactic, but it also is I think it's important that a story is passed through the body, that you give a sense of place and of experience, at least for my writing. And so it was important to me to kind of put myself in those configurations of kind of place and time, so that I could talk about it in a way that felt real.
Yeah, and I want to go back to your idea of procrastination. I think a lot of members in our audience can relate to that, yeah? All right, we got thumbs up. Thank you for sharing your research process. And I realize that we haven't gotten to talk more about his book, right? We're just right now talking a lot about Tom, his writing process, how he became a writer. So why don't we actually start talking more about the book itself? So please tell us about the inspiration of writing The 1,000 Crimes of Ming Tzu.
Yeah. So I grew up in New York City, and I actually didn't come out west of the Mississippi until college. Although I have been saying that, and my mother actually, one of the first times that I said that, she actually saw the interview, and she said, do you not remember when we took you to Disney World and the Grand Canyon? We did this whole thing. Like we saw all of the American West, and like here's pictures of it, and here's like you as a child at Yellowstone. And like, no, I do not. That is simply not in my memory. And so, I mean, I think the first time I was like as a conscious human being in the West was when I came to college, and I got I'd somehow managed to secure a driver's license while I was a teenager in New York City, but never used it. So on paper, I was good and able to drive, and so I got my first car out here, like a secondhand little Volkswagen, and so it was this kind of great confluence of being totally unsupervised and also suddenly free with a car. So I spent a lot of time just driving around the area and going out to like Anza Borrego or Joshua Tree, and it was just like I had never seen this kind of stuff before in my life. And I knew that I wanted to write something that kind of captured that feeling of being in these totally alien places. And I knew that the Western was the genre for reverence of landscape. There is no other genre that is as fixated or obsessed with the effect of geology on people. So I knew I wanted to write a Western, and I knew also that I wanted to have a Chinese-American protagonist. That was very important to me. And then kind of with those two elements in mind, and desperately trying to avoid actually writing it, I ended up doing a lot of research. So I learned about the Transcontinental Railroad. I learned about this whole history. And as I did that research, the bounds of the story kind of became clearer. And I was more able to kind of go and produce, a plot that made sense.
What character do you think was the most fun to write and create? And then comparatively,
yeah.
like what was the most challenging?
Absolutely. So there's a character in the book, Hunter Reed. He's probably my favorite character to write. He's a little boy. He's deaf, but he has this kind of telepathic way of talking into other people's heads. And so I learned there's a lot that I had to kind of do because it's an interesting character to fit into a story, especially if you want it to be kind of accurate and also kind of true to the time period. So I looked up old, like what some of the very first American Sign Language textbooks and kind of articles about that. There's a great video of someone who, I think by the time the video is taken in the 1930s, he's almost like 85, but he performs the Lord's Prayer in American Sign Language, but one of the first iterations of it. And so, to kind of have to like do all that and figure out how I could make this character, who's also a little boy, how I could write this character and have him be believable and also, at this strange intersection of being both more than, because he's got this telepathy, but also in this marginalized position because of his deafness. So his character was a lot of fun to write. The character that I had the most trouble with was actually Ming. Because he begins as this kind of classic, really tropological, like Western Stoic. And the problem with a Stoic character is like they don't really have much to say, and they don't really think a lot about what's going on around them. And so I found myself having to kind of work in situations where he could be surprised or caught off guard. And so that was the most challenging character to write.
So part of your book, right, Ming is obviously the main character of the book and who's Chinese American. And because it is set in a setting back then, right, in the 1800s, where there's racism involved, especially in the United States. So how do you structure racism throughout the book especially with Ming Su?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, when the book first came out, it was, I think 2021, and there was like this big, Stop Asian Hate movement. And so a lot of it was like, Asian hate is on the rise now. And I think one of the things that we forget is that like this mechanism of othering and of racism, it has really long roots. It's the roots go back to the same, they're coeval with the country itself. And one of the things that always struck me was, especially when doing the research and trying to figure out how to, place this Chinese American character within this traditionally white genre, was this idea of being able to show this kind of experience of racism, but also show that it is kind of ontologically the same as racism today. That it's no different. That like the racism of the past has maybe transmuted, but it remains today, and that these are problems with like 8 heads and they keep growing back every time you cut one off. But what struck me was like how similar it was, even the newspaper articles that I was looking at from 1869 and the ones that you were seeing on like Facebook comments in 2020. It was all the same thing, and so in a way it was both discouraging but also a revelation, because it shows that it's not that the racism was not like a reaction, but actually a structure of reality. That it was one of the invariants that has remained throughout time. And so, one thing that I noticed a lot was newspaper articles would mention like, there's one where the train is going up around the mountain, and then the reporter says, John leans out the window and he waves his hat. And I kept on seeing this name John, and it actually means John Chinaman. And every time John would come up, it would refer to this kind of like total collapse of Asian Americans in the country at the time into this singular identity, which was then kind of recoded as this traditionally white name John. But it was not difficult in terms of production of this kind of experience, but what was difficult was making it feel of the time, because it was so conserved from 1869 to today.
So I actually have a follow-up now.
Yeah.
So as you're doing your research, right, you're seeing these 1800 like news reports and articles, right, where the language itself is really structured around racist ideologies, right? And I'm curious, right, with the news outlets, with the social media, everything that's going on, that you, during the time that you were writing this book, did you see any similarities or any differences in these articles and language around racism? And if so, like what differences and similarities did you notice?
Yeah, I don't even know if, I think the differences are mostly in terms of like lexicon, like the words that we use. But what remains is the sense of like the perpetual other, like this kind of the foreign presence in our country that is both conspiratorial and incredibly powerful, but at the same time weak and kind of feminized and relegated to kind of positions of subordinates. But I think what struck me about what is the same throughout is that it is a fear, and it's a fear which then kind of converts into hate. But it's a response that is directed at this kind of destabilizing other, whose presence calls into question the kind of structures of society that were extant at the time, right? So the workforce of Chinese laborers, the vast majority of the men, in excess of 95%, who show up in the 1860s, they become a stand-in for a tenuous labor market, right? And they become the target of racial hatred because they are viewed as the destabilizing force that is preventing white Americans from getting jobs, right? And that logic shows up. It's not limited to 1869, right? Like Vincent Chin, that's the same thing that happens 100 years in the future. It's the same thing that continues. So I think if there are differences, I would say that the major difference today is the algorithmic quality of news feeds and timelines, where they have an ability not only to entertain these kinds of coded fears and kind of racist responses, but even to encourage them and to kind of allow their spread at exponential orders faster than it could happen in the 1860s.
I know you briefly alluded to in one of your previous answers about the Western genre being a very white-dominated genre traditionally. So I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on that. How might placing Ming Su into this context be able to subvert the dominant tropes of the Western genre as you see them?
Absolutely. I think the Western. I love the Western as a genre. It's the only one that we've got, right? It's the only one that we made. The romance we inherited, all these other genres of writing are not American, but the Western is kind of at base an American response. And because of that, it's been so intertwined with this American project of colonial settler dominance, right? So the Western is not just, or traditionally, it isn't just a story about cowboys. It also is a story about, it's a normative story. It says that that there's an indigenous population which ought to be removed, that the United States is a country which ought to extend from coast to coast, that the industrialization of the railroad ought to have happened, that these are all good things. And I think that part of the Western, for me the question was is that extricable from the genre? Is the genre tainted at base from its close association with and ultimately enrollment in this project? And I think that's what I wanted to explore by putting in this kind of Chinese American character. I wanted to see if it was a myth-making machine that had been used towards a certain end, but it wasn't beholden to it, or if it did kind of have to reproduce these structures of dominance that had informed its creation. And I think what I found was that it's an absolutely expansive genre. It can tolerate huge stresses, and it's charged with this with the power that it has from spending more than 100 years as this engine of American cultural identity making. And for that reason, it's also it was a really fruitful genre to put in Chinese American, to put in this as you'll find out if you read it, a traveling circus troupe also of marginalized identities, and to see to what extent that bends the boundaries of the genre, and to what extent the genre is able to place them within this kind of mythic past of our nation. And the form of the Western is no stranger to being bent and kind of played with. Westerns have been to space more often than they've featured the people who are actually there. And so it's not a genre which is inhospitable to play. But I think it also is a genre that has really been involved with a certain kind of project. And I really like modern Westerns. I think the genre is being really weird and fun and much more diverse lately. And so I like where it's going, and I'm relieved that it's not a racial or kind of colonialist genre at base.
Well, thank you for that. I have a lot of other questions, but I also want to make sure that you all have some time to ask your questions too. But before we do all that fun stuff, I would actually like to invite Tom to read a passage that we picked out in his book. So I'm going to have you read this excerpt. Hang on a second. Let me grab the book and my Post-it. I'm going to have you read this excerpt. And then well, how about you read it and then I'll ask my question? Yeah?
Yeah.
Sound good? Okay. All right. If you can read from there to the end.
Perfect. He woke with a start in the middle of the night without realizing he'd been sleeping. There, next to his leg, coiled a dark mass of muscle. From the pitted snout of a desert viper, a tongue flicked in and out, tasting the air. Ming did not move. The snake slid alongside his body and paused before his face as though examining his features. Ming watched it. Thick rings of muscle rippled along its length. It opened its mouth and gave a soft hiss, almost conversational. "You won't take me now, will you?" Ming asked aloud. The viper spoke in sibilants he could not understand. "It ain't my time yet, sir," Ming said. "I ain't finished." For a long time the snake was quiet. Then it opened its mouth again, wider now, unhinging its jaw, and thrust its fangs out, retracted them once more. At last it lowered its head to the sand and lay motionless. "Thank you," Ming said. Now the snake crossed over to where the coals of the fire still smoldered red like devil's eyes and paused at the threshold of the fire pit. Then it slid sedately in among the embers. A flame started up again, caught along the snake's skin as though it were but oilcloth. Soon the whole length of the viper burned without smoke or sound. It moved afire and arranged itself into a coiled heap in the center of the pit, and then its eyes clouded over, and it went still. The checkered skin flaked away in shreds of incandescent ash, and then the fire spread to the striated muscles, which too burned to dust. When daybreak came, only the bones of the snake remained in the warm ashes, a nest of delicate ribs and interlocking vertebrae, buttressing a pale and hollowed skull. And though Ming had not returned to sleep, he was not tired.
Thank you. I love hearing your reading. All right. So my question for you, without spoiling the book for all the audiences who might have not gotten a chance to read it or finish it, I'm very curious about the purpose of this scene. Like, what is the purpose of the snake's encounter with Ming Tzu?
That is a question that you, as well as my editor, had upon reading the manuscript. So that scene, it's been in a couple different places in the manuscript. It showed up in the beginning, in the earlier draft. It showed up very close to the start of the book. And I remember one of the feedback items that I got from my editor on the first round was, I don't really know what this is doing here. And he was like, if it's not, like, you should either turn up the symbolism elsewhere in the book, or and he was like, honestly, I would, if you're okay with it, I would omit it. And what we were doing is we were working sequentially through the manuscript, and so he had gotten only to the earlier chapters. So I said, of course, I'll remove it. And I kicked it further down, hoping that he would come to realize that it was good. And so we're working along, and then about a week later, he says, "Hey, I noticed Snake's back, and I don't know if it works here either." And at this point, we're in the middle of the book, and I was like, "Of course, you're right." And I figured, well, let's just try it a third time. So I moved it ahead one more time into a different spot. And another week went by, and he got back to me, and he was like, "Oh, I get it." I like it. And I was like, "Thank you." And so that's where it ended up. But the idea of it, I think, and I'll cross myself as like a critic, trained in kind of literary criticism. I'll say, if what I'm saying does not agree with your interpretation of the book, by all means, I don't exist. I think that like after Northrop Frye, like, what the author says has peculiar interest, because I did write it, but not peculiar authority. So my interpretation is not necessarily the be all end all. All that to say, I mean, I think the book is inflected with kind of like old school like biblical overtones, which I think a lot of Westerns share. And the figure of the serpent is such an evocative kind of character, and to have this kind of conversation between a human and a non-human was also very interesting to me, especially with this this question of acceptance, right? Which kind of runs throughout the book. Of is Ming a character who is moving through his land, and is that feeling reciprocated, or is he forever? Is he truly a perpetual outsider? And I think to have these non-human agents kind of greet him and respond to him, I think was a way of kind of exploring that question. And especially to have the snake burn itself up in the fire, I thought was a very especially because you have this kind of traditional image of like man crushing the serpent under his heel, but to have the snake kind of do that to himself, and then to remain as almost like an ossuary, just nothing but bones at daybreak. I think I found it very interesting. It was one of my favorite scenes to write, but I think it is cryptic, and I think it is in its right place now after being moved twice. But I don't know if that covers all the bases. But that's a little bit of why I wrote that.
Thank you so much for sharing, Tom. I think that's a really good note to end our little discussion on. Lots of things to think about. And then I'm going to open the floor for questions from the audience. If you just kind of gesture, I will maybe run over with the mic so that you can ask the question. And then, or Stephanie will run over with the mic.
Any questions? Oh, we got one up here. I'm going to get my cardio in today.
Hi, thank you for coming. I am very curious about that story that you shared of like the editor and revising process of moving the scene. And so I guess I'm kind of wondering like what your kind of approach to feedback and what that process has been like in your writing and how that might be different working on a book like this compared to like academic papers that you might have worked on at Pomona.
Absolutely. So I think the goals of writing, either in fiction or in critical writing, I think remain the same, which is you're kind of laying out an argument. And in academic writing, you have to make your case much more explicitly, but you're doing the same thing with a book. Like the book has a point. It's oriented towards something. You're trying to make a point. And so you're looking for feedback, or I am accepting of feedback that is that I can tell comes from that same point of view. And that's why like me and my editor got along so well, and that's why like I really admire and value his feedback, is because you have to feel like they're on the same page as you. I think one of the things about writing is that you come to have this kind of platonic ideal of it in your head. And that's kind of what you're optimizing towards as you do revisions, where you say like, it's not that this doesn't sound right in isolation, but that this gets me closer to the perfect version of this text that I can hallucinate in my head. I mean, that being said, like, it's hard not to have a very visceral, instant, reflexive response to feedback, which is like absolutely not. And I think like I don't think it's worth trying to get rid of that. I think it's good, like in kind of like the platitude of emotion. It means that you're alive, right? But I think like being angry at getting feedback on a piece of work is part of the process because it means that you're invested in it. And I think the real skill that you have to learn is to be able to say like, and they're right. And I think that's the sting of really good feedback is you're angry because you wish you had seen it as well. But it does have this kind of force of as soon as you get it, you're like, that's absolutely better. Like that fits better. And even like, especially for projects like this, like at some point someone just takes it away from you. So, we're going back and forth on edits and I'm like constantly like tweaking this word and that word. And then eventually, like someone in a suit says like, hey, we need it. We're going to start printing it. Like you can't touch it anymore. And that doesn't make the editing stop. So even, today when I read sections of it, I will make edits on the fly. Because I'm always trying to get towards the perfect version of it that you'll never be able to achieve, but you do always try to get closer to it. So yeah, I think for feedback in general, like, if you're angry at it because it's good feedback, like that's the best that you can ask for, because it means that you have someone else who is trying to do the same thing, who kind of sees the music that you're playing and wants to help it improve.
Tom, for sharing that. I think you modeled how writing in itself can always change, progress, and strengthen, right? And sometimes it's never really done until you say it's done. But yours like, no, it's not done. I'm going to keep going at this. So thank you. Does anyone else have another question? I can run over this mic over to you. You're going to help me with my cardio. Ooh, look down here. Woohoo.
Thank you, Mr. Tom. My name is Robinson Lee. I'm a sophomore at Pitzer College doing combined major in history and politics. I've really enjoyed the talk so far. But one question that's been in my mind, because in the past 2 decades, we've seen a lot of more attempts at diversity in media and American media. I think about Hamilton. I think about how one of the criticisms I was asked during an interview was, why are we telling white stories with black actors? And I was thinking about your talk and thinking about the way and wanted to ask if you how did you interact with this question from an Asian American perspective? Do you subvert or challenge, or how do you interact with the possibility that when you're writing this book, you may have been telling like a white story with like Asian faces?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. My response is that this is not actually a white story. That the reason that we think Westerns are white stories is because we've only seen Westerns with white characters. But Chinese Americans built the Transcontinental Railroad. They worked on those lines. They were here. Their impact on the nation has been to kind of set up a long question about what makes an American. Even the question of like natural born citizenship. That was settled in the Supreme Court by a Chinese American who couldn't return after the Chinese Exclusion Act. So I think that like it's not so much that I think, but the question is between revisionism and kind of recuperative writing. That this is not an attempt to rewrite or reinscribe the contours of the Western and kind of switch out the parts of it, but it's to recuperate the stories that do exist there and bring them into this same kind of mythic stature that we've done with other stories from that time. So there are Chinese American stories from the Old West, same as there are indigenous stories, black stories, Latinx stories, but those are not stories that have been often published or kind of allowed to enter and circulate within culture. And so we do come to think of the Western as a white genre, but it need not be. And I think that is that's been a lot of the fun of kind of working in these genre modes is an attempt at recuperating these stories rather than rewriting or kind of crossing out and marking over.
That was a good one. Anyone else have any other questions? Ooh, over in the back. Oh, for everybody, for accessibility, I'm going to run over this mic over to you. You're helping me with my cardio.
Do you have any more stories planned in the Western genre?
I'm working on a second novel. It is not a Western. It's going to be science fiction adjacent, let's say. It's a family generational epic, and it's set in the Great Plains. And that's all I'll say about that for now. Not for secrecy, but simply because I'm working it out as well.
Sorry. I'm so sorry. I did not see your hand. Here you go.
Hi, thank you so much for your interesting talk. I'm a junior at Pitzer student studying anthropology. I was really interested in when you talk about your process of writing, and I feel like a lot of time for me, creative writing and like writing fiction is a lot of the time it's a process of healing for me, and like I'm mostly writing like for myself. And I was really interested in when you talk about how like writing itself is like painful and like you want to avoid it as much as possible. So I'm just simply wondering like what gets you like going, what gets you write so much. So yeah.
I think I definitely feel that as well. Like I think writing, especially writing fiction or memoir or anything like that, we're actually narrativizing, right? And by that I mean we're setting up like causal links. And I think that's why it can be so recuperative to kind of write about yourself or kind of explore your own stories or history, because you're setting up a kind of sequence that makes sense intuitively. that this happens and then this happens and then this happens, right? And it's that connective tissue, that and then, that is really the difficulty of writing as well. Because I mean, for me, like especially fiction, like you can write literally anything, and that's a huge curse. You have to decide which paths to take from a field of infinite possibilities. And that's why I really value research as well, because it helps put kind of guardrails on what I'm going to be writing about. And if there's a guardrail that, if there's a historical guardrail that like is really in the way, like then I can make a decision to bypass that. But I think like for me, I'm chase the satisfaction of making a good piece of writing. I think for me, it's a very kind of artisanal or mechanical kind of metaphor of like there's a certain kind of pleasure in getting a board of wood to be dead flat and dead square on the side. I think there's a similar kind of pleasure to be sought in getting your writing to be exactly as you wanted it, to like tune up all the parts and have it working together. I think is a joy, and I think the horrendous agony of writing is that most of the time it does not work. But it's worth it for those moments when you say like that's good writing. I like it. I worked on it. That is good. That's a good piece of writing. And I'm just kind of chasing that high.
There are questions? I apologize if I don't see your hand. Try to step up. Oh, I'm sorry, Todd. I'm going to go over here and then you, Todd. Sorry. Okay.
So with your writing, have you ever dealt with anything like, say, writer's block, or say you get to a certain plot point, you're not sure how exactly to go forward? And then if you have, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I deal with writer's block literally every second of every day. Like, it's probably more accurate to say that I'm usually blocked and sometimes I make it through. There's a couple of answers, right? So one of the answers that I tell myself if I'm filling up for it, one of the answers is if you beat your head against the wall for long enough, something will happen, right? You might not get through the wall. Pretty good odds actually you don't get through the wall, but something will happen. You will tire of doing so. And I think usually like if you encounter that, especially for like plot points, right, where you're like, I just can't get these characters, like this plot just doesn't make sense. And you stand there at the wall and you just slam your head into the wall again and again, it doesn't work. That's probably not a plot point that you should pursue, right? Like sometimes writer's blocks are there because we're trying to force something that doesn't work, but other times just because like writing is not just literally putting words on paper, right? Writing is and this is a very convenient definition for me because it means I don't really have to do that very much, but writing is also walking around. Writing is living your life. With a kind of open eye towards moments that you can kind of steal, right? You're like a magpie. You're assembling a collection of small moments or small features about life and your experience that you want to really sit with deeply. And you have to have something where you can just keep track of those things because you'll lose them. And even just like the simple act of getting to the habit of when you see something that you really like, or when you have a thought that you really like, taking it down, trusting your instincts, right? So if I'm really stuck, I'll look back and I'll see if there's like moments, right? Like, a classic one is like you're coming out of like Costco or something and like the sunset over the parking lot is the most beautiful one you've ever seen, right? Like take that down. That's useful. And then the other thing is, the kind of more mechanical solution to writer's block is just to have more than one fire going, right? So if you're really struggling with one project, like switch over to another thing, like try working at that for a while, and then maybe by the time you hit a block on that second thing, the first thing will have cleared up. But you're really writing all the time because writing is a form of cognition, and you're thinking all the time, and you're living all the time. And that's the stuff that we form writing out of. And the fellow who sits in their office all day every day like won't have much to write about after a certain period of time because there's simply not that much happening. So I think the answer is just to be like aware and observant and keeping things down and not beat yourself up over it.
Okay, I think Todd had a question.
Thanks for your sharing with us today. And I guess, as an Asian American author, international author, how does that kind of inform, and your background and your identity, does that inform what you want to write next? Does that do you feel that boxes you in at all, or kind of pigeonholes you if you not, you have a successful revisioning of a Western with a Chinese American protagonist? But does that kind of pigeonhole you in that sense that that's what you're going to write about more, or how do you kind of wrestle with that, or decide on what you want to write next?
Yeah, I think I think there is a risk of being pigeonholed, but I think also I like, the question of, I was recently asked are you going to, are all of your protagonists going to be Asian American? And my answer is a resounding yes. Right. Because crucially, we don't ask white authors if they're always going to write about white people. And I think part of, and by that, I mean, I don't think of it as being locked in or boxed in to write about Asian people, because I don't have to write about Asian people. Right. It's a choice that I am continuously making because I think it's worthwhile. But there's an extent to, I mean, especially the extent that you have to self-fashion an image as an author, where you fill a market niche. I'm fortunate enough that I'll be able to, I'm able to kind of pick and choose what, it's not my, it doesn't give me health insurance, for instance, right? So I'm fortunate enough that I have the kind of freedom and space to work on genres and modes that I think are interesting. But I think pigeonholing is a function of capital. Pigeonholing is discovering a very efficient or optimum solution to getting another paycheck so that you can eat. But I think that it need not be a creative restriction. And oftentimes you can turn a pigeonhole into a creative choice. So I think there is a kind of, there's a feeling of perhaps being pigeonholed, but I would say that I am choosing to always have an Asian American character in my books because it's a choice.
Hang on, we got a question. I'm running over.
Thanks for your talk. I just have a question, maybe more backwards looking. So what's your relationship like with your inspiration, sources of inspiration, people who've influenced you? Because you talked a lot about growing up reading lots of stories about white characters. So what's your relationship like with these sources?
I mean, they're good books. I loved reading those books. I harbor no ill will towards that. I think what I took issue with is if we're not careful, the stories that we select and that we tell will come to foreclose the future for us. And so I think that experience is not is not to knock at any of those stories, but to say that we should be careful that we don't set up that kind of situation. And as far as my kind of my influences, I really loved I love Steinbeck. I think he's got a really good sense of place. I love Herman Melville. I wrote my undergrad thesis on Melville, much to the chagrin of all of my friends. And I love works in translation. I think the answer is that I like when stuff is weird and broad and diverse and kind of comes from all sorts of different places. And I think it's the frog and being boiled slowly. You don't notice that all of the stories that you surround yourself with are of a type until there's no escape. And I think even the situation in libraries today is very different from what it was when I was growing up, and I think that's a great thing. So I think my relation with them is they're good stories. I love them. I wish I had more and different ones, but that's not to say that I didn't love the ones that I had.
All right, so I think we have time for one more question. Does anyone have a burning question? Oh, we. No, you're good.
As a person who worked with you in the Writing Center long ago at Pomona College, I guess I have the maybe it's only a Writing Center only question, but maybe it's helpful for everyone. I've been thinking about it, which is what, as a person who's going to get his dissertation defended this quarter at UC Davis. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And also who's a published fiction writer. Like, what commonalities and differences do you see between writing fiction and writing nonfiction?
Yeah, I think it's the same. It pulls from the same battery. It's the same sort of skill. It's a different mode. You know, I think they're like, I think of it as left hand and right hand. That there are some things that I can do better with one side than with the other. But I think at the end of the day, we're like, they're all circling around the same thing. It's two different approaches to answering questions. And I think writing fiction is a way of like creating a machine that poses the question and maybe has a space for the answer. And then writing criticism is a way of trying to diagnose and analyze that machine. But I think, you know, we're kind of circling this ineffable, strange attractor at the center of all of our work that the real challenge of writing is always going to be, how can you get closer to that thing that is somehow central to all of our experiences but totally unable to be put into words.
All right. I know that we are in the way of your lunch right now.
Let's go get lunch.
Yeah. Eunice?
There will be lunch outside for event attendees, and we will be hanging out. And yeah, and there will also be 40 copies of The Thousand Crimes of Ming for you all to receive since you attended the event.
Also, Tom will be signing books. So if you would like to join us outside of the auditorium, we'll have a setup where he can sign your book for you. And then otherwise, why don't we all give Tom a huge thank you for being here, sharing his writing process, sharing his story, sharing his inspiration, and just being an overall fabulous person in general. And if you want to know more about Tom, ask him about his cat.
Thanks for having me.
So
I had a great
much.
time. Thank you so much.
Right outside, you'll see the food right outside in the lobby. There are some tables out on the lawn to the right towards McConnell where you can enjoy your lunch. And then hopefully Tom will be able to sign your book for you. Thank you all for being here.